What if the turning point between Iran and America wasn't a missile, but a moment of trust that quietly fractured? In the early 1950s, Iran was not yet an enemy of the United States. It was a nation trying to reclaim control of its own wealth, especially oil. At the center stood Mohammad Mossadegh, a democratically elected leader who believed Iran's resources should belong to its people, not foreign powers. His decision to nationalize Iran's oil industry directly challenged British interests and caught Washington's attention. What followed wasn't war in the traditional sense. It was a strategy. In 1953, under the shadow of the Cold War, the United States and Britain orchestrated a covert Operation 1953 Iranian coup to remove Mossadegh from power. Fear of Soviet influence was the public justification, but control and influence in the region were the deeper stakes. The coup succeeded. Mossadegh was overthrown, and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was strengthened as ruler. To Washington, this was stability. To many Iranians, it was betrayal, an external force deciding their future. For the next 25 years, the US backed the Shah's regime, supplying aid, weapons, and political support. Iran modernized rapidly, but beneath the surface, resentment grew. Many citizens saw a widening gap between the elite and the ordinary people, and the Shah's rule became increasingly authoritarian. Then came 1979. The Iranian Revolution wasn't just political, it was deeply emotional. It was a rejection of foreign influence and internal oppression. The Shah fled, and in his place rose a new system led by Ruhollah Khomeini, who openly challenged the United States. Months later, anger reached a boiling point. Iranian students stormed the US embassy in Tehran, leading to the Iran hostage crisis. For 444 days, American diplomats were held captive. To Americans, this was a shocking act of aggression. To many Iranians, it was retaliation, an echo of 1953. From that moment, trust collapsed completely. Decades later, tensions continue, sanctions, threats, negotiations, but the question remains unchanged. Who betrayed who? Was it the United States, intervening in a nation's sovereignty, or Iran, turning anger into confrontation? History doesn't always offer clean answers. It offers perspective, and sometimes the deepest conflicts aren't born in open war, but in decisions made quietly, long before the world is watching. The turning point didn't begin with chaos. It began with a decision, quiet, deliberate, and deeply unsettling to those watching from afar. In 1951, a man stepped into power with a vision that would shake global politics. Mohammad Mossadegh was not a revolutionary in the traditional sense. He was educated, calculated, and chosen through a democratic process. But his mission was bold: to take back control of Iran's oil. For decades, that oil had been dominated by foreign interests, particularly the British. The wealth beneath Iran's soil was flowing outward, while many Iranians saw little benefit. Mossadegh's move to nationalize the oil industry wasn't just economic, it was symbolic. It was about sovereignty, dignity, and reclaiming what many believed had long been taken. But in the early 1950s, the world was not just divided by borders, it was divided by fear. The Cold War had turned every political shift into a potential threat. In Washington and London, Mossadegh's actions raised a dangerous question. If Iran drifted too far from Western influence, could it fall into Soviet hands? That fear set a plan in motion. In 1953, under layers of secrecy, the United States and the United Kingdom backed a covert operation known as the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat. It wasn't tanks rolling across borders or bombs falling from the sky. It was quieter than that: propaganda, political pressure, and carefully engineered unrest. The objective was simple: remove Mossadegh. And it worked. Mossadegh was arrested, his government dismantled. In his place, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly fled the country, returned with stronger backing and greater authority. To the United States, this was stability restored. A potential ally secured in a region growing increasingly unpredictable. But inside Iran, the story felt different. For many, this wasn't protection, it was interference. A democratically chosen leader had been removed, not by his people, but by foreign powers acting in their own interest. What had been presented as a safeguard against instability began to look, to some, like a betrayal of trust. And that perception didn't disappear. It settled quietly into the national memory, shaping how future generations would interpret every interaction with the West. The coup of 1953 didn't just change leadership, it changed perspective. It drew a line between how events were justified on one side and how they were experienced on the other. Because history is rarely defined by what happens alone. It's defined by who tells the story and who has to live with it. The moment that changed everything didn't look like a war. It looked like a decision made in offices, far from the streets of Tehran. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh rose to power through a democratic process. He wasn't a general or a rebel. He was a nationalist with a clear objective: take back control of Iran's most valuable resource, oil. For years, that oil had been dominated by foreign interests, especially British companies. Revenues flowed outward, while many Iranians struggled at home. Mossadegh's decision to nationalize the oil industry wasn't just economic policy, it was a statement. Iran would no longer accept being managed from the outside. Inside Iran, many saw hope. But outside Iran, the move triggered an alarm. The early 1950s were shaped by the tension of the Cold War. In Washington and London, leaders viewed the world through a single question: who controls what next? Mossadegh's independence created uncertainty. If Iran slipped from Western influence, could it drift toward the Soviet Union? That fear became justification. In 1953, a covert plan was set in motion: the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat. It wasn't an open invasion. There were no official declarations. Instead, it unfolded quietly through propaganda, political manipulation, and coordinated unrest designed to weaken Mossadegh's grip on power. Tensions spread through the streets of Tehran. Demonstrations grew, confusion replaced clarity. And in the middle of it all, the government began to fracture. Then, the decisive moment came. Mossadegh was removed from power, arrested, his authority stripped away. The system he represented collapsed almost overnight. In his place, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi returned, no longer as a fragile monarch, but as a ruler backed strongly by Western support. To the United States and its allies, this was a strategic success. A potential shift toward instability had been stopped. An ally had been secured in a critical region. But on the streets of Iran, the meaning felt very different. A leader chosen by the people had been pushed aside, not through election, but through external influence. What was framed as protection in one part of the world began to feel like interference in another. And that difference in perspective mattered. Because this moment didn't just change leadership, it changed trust. It planted a question deep in Iran's national consciousness. If decisions about their future could be shaped from outside once, could it happen again? To some, this was protection. To others, betrayal. And in that single divide of interpretation, the foundation of future conflict was quietly laid, not with explosions, but with a shift in belief that would echo for decades. Power didn't return to Iran with celebration. It returned quietly, with backing, with structure, and with control. After the fall of Mossadegh, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi stood firmly on the throne once again. But this time, his position was different. It was no longer fragile. It was reinforced politically, financially, and militarily by the United States. To Washington, the Shah represented stability in a region that could easily shift toward Soviet influence. Billions in aid, modern weapons, and strategic support flowed into Iran. On the surface, the country began to transform. Roads expanded, industries grew, cities modernized. But beneath that progress, something else was taking shape. Control. The Shah's government became increasingly centralized, and dissent, any form of opposition, was no longer tolerated. At the center of this tightening grip was SAVAK, the intelligence and security agency created with foreign assistance. Its purpose was clear: monitor, detect, and eliminate threats to the regime. But threat became a flexible word. Writers, students, religious figures, anyone who questioned authority risked surveillance, arrest, or worse. Conversations grew quieter. Criticism moved into whispers. Fear settled into everyday life, not always visible, but always present. To the outside world, Iran looked like a success story. A modernizing nation, aligned with Western interests, holding a strategic position in global politics. But inside the country, many experienced a different reality, one where freedom felt limited and power felt distant. The divide between perception and experience kept widening. For many Iranians, the presence of Western influence, especially American, no longer felt like partnership. It felt like oversight. Decisions made at the top seemed disconnected from the people below. The memory of 1953 had not disappeared. It lingered, shaping how every action was interpreted. What one side called support, the other began to see as control. And that distinction mattered, because anger doesn't always erupt immediately. Sometimes, it builds slowly in conversations at home, in silent frustrations, in moments where people begin to feel that their voice no longer matters. By the late 1970s, that quiet tension had spread across different layers of society. It wasn't just political, it was personal. A growing belief that Iran's direction was no longer entirely its own. The alliance that once promised stability had created something more complicated. It had produced order but also resentment, progress but also pressure. The alliance began to feel less like friendship and more like control. And in that feeling, unspoken but widely shared, the foundation for the next turning point was already forming. It didn't begin as a single moment. It began as a feeling shared, whispered, and then shouted across an entire nation. By the late 1970s, the pressure inside Iran had reached a breaking point. Years of control, silence, and growing inequality had created something deeper than political opposition. It had created conviction, and into that moment stepped a voice from exile: Ruhollah Khomeini. From outside the country, Khomeini's words spread rapidly through recordings, sermons, and networks of supporters. His message was clear and uncompromising. The system under the Shah was not just flawed, it was unjust. And for many Iranians, his voice gave shape to what they had been feeling for years. What followed was not isolated unrest. It was a wave. Across cities, towns, and villages, people took to the streets. Students, workers, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens stood side by side. These were not just protests, they were expressions of accumulated frustration. The kind that had been building quietly, now impossible to contain. At first, the demonstrations were met with resistance. Security forces tried to control the crowds. But each attempt to silence the movement only seemed to amplify it. The streets filled again and again with larger numbers, louder voices, and stronger resolve. This was no longer about reform. It was about change. The Iranian Revolution unfolded not as a single event, but as a series of escalating moments, each one pushing the country closer to a point of no return. Strikes disrupted the economy. Government authority weakened, and the image of control that had defined the Shah's rule began to collapse in real time. Then came the moment that confirmed it. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left the country, not as a victor, but as a ruler without a foundation to stand on. For millions watching, his departure wasn't just political, it was symbolic. It marked the end of an era that many believed had been imposed, not chosen. And into that vacuum, something new emerged. Khomeini returned to Iran, welcomed by massive crowds. But this was not simply a transfer of power. It was a transformation of the system itself. The monarchy was dismantled, and in its place rose a new structure, the Islamic Republic. For some, it was a long-awaited correction. A reclaiming of identity, control, and direction. A belief that the country was finally in the hands of its own people. For millions, this was not rebellion, it was justice. But like every turning point in history, the meaning depended on where you stood. Because revolutions don't just end one story. They begin another, often just as complex, just as uncertain, and just as powerful. This moment didn't begin with violence. It began with a decision, one that looked humane on the surface, but carried heavy meaning beneath. In 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had been forced from power during the revolution, was granted entry into the United States for medical treatment. To many in the West, this was a simple act of compassion. A former leader, unwell, given care, nothing more. But in Iran, the memory of the past was still fresh. For many Iranians, the Shah was not just a former ruler, he was a symbol of a system they believed had been supported, even protected, by foreign influence. So when he entered the United States, the reaction was immediate and intense. It was seen not as a humanitarian gesture, but as a political signal, and that perception changed everything. On November 4, 1979, a group of Iranian students aligned with revolutionary sentiment approached the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. What followed was a moment that would define an era. The embassy gates were stormed, and the Iran hostage crisis began. Inside the embassy, American diplomats and staff suddenly found themselves cut off from the world. Communications were severed, security collapsed, and what was once considered neutral ground became a center of global tension. In total, 52 Americans were taken hostage. What was expected to be a brief standoff turned into something far longer and far more complex. For 140 days passed. Days turned into months. Negotiations unfolded behind closed doors. Political pressure built on both sides, and across the world, the crisis dominated headlines, shaping public perception and diplomatic relations. For Americans, this was a shocking and deeply personal crisis. Citizens held captive, uncertainty surrounding their safety, and a sense of violation that resonated across the nation. For many Iranians, however, the event carried a different meaning. It was seen by some as a response on act tied 2 years of political tension, particularly the memory of the 1953 coup, and the broader relationship between Iran and Western powers. Two perspectives, one event, and neither side saw it the same way. The crisis tested more than just governments. It tested trust. It exposed how history, memory, and perception can shape the meaning of a single moment in entirely different ways. One nation saw compassion, the other saw betrayal. And in that divide, the relationship between Iran and the United States reached a breaking point, a moment where dialogue was replaced by distance and understanding gave way to suspicion. Because once trust is broken at that level, rebuilding it is no longer just political, it becomes historical. After the hostage crisis, something changed permanently between Iran and the United States. The open confrontation ended, but what followed was quieter, more calculated, and often harder to see. It became a conflict without a clear battlefield. Over the decades, the United States imposed layers of economic sanctions on Iran. These weren't visible like bombs or soldiers, but their impact was real. Trade slowed, financial systems tightened. International access became restricted. For many ordinary Iranians, these measures shaped everyday life, jobs, currency value, and long-term stability. At the same time, tensions expanded beyond borders. Across the Middle East, both nations found themselves involved in a complex network of indirect conflicts, often called proxy conflicts. Instead of direct war, influence was extended through alliances, support, and competing interests in countries like Iraq, Syria, and beyond. Each move was calculated, each response measured. This wasn't a war you could easily point to on a map. It was layered, strategic, and ongoing. In the background, another concern began to rise: nuclear capability. Iran's nuclear program became a central point of global tension. For the United States and its allies, the concern was potential weaponization. For Iran, the program was often presented as a matter of sovereignty and energy independence. Negotiations came and went. Agreements were made, challenged, and at times abandoned. Trust, already fragile, continued to be tested. Diplomacy existed, but it was always under pressure. Then, in 2020, the conflict took a sharp and unmistakable turn. Qasem Soleimani, a powerful and influential figure in Iran's military structure, was killed in a U.S. drone strike in Iraq. His role in regional operations made him a central figure in Iran's strategic network. To the United States, the strike was justified as a targeted action against a perceived threat. To Iran, it was a direct and aggressive act against one of its highest-ranking leaders. The response was immediate. Tensions escalated. The world watched closely, waiting to see if this moment would spiral into full-scale war. It didn't, but it didn't bring peace either. Instead, it reinforced the reality that had been building for decades. This was not a conflict defined by traditional war. There were no declared battle lines, No formal ceasefires, no clear ending, just a continuous state of tension. No official war, but no real peace either. Because when relationships between nations reach this point, every decision carries weight. Every action echoes further than intended, and every moment becomes part of a larger story still unfolding quietly, strategically, and without a final chapter in sight. History doesn't always speak in a single voice. Sometimes it splits into two narratives, to interpretations, and to deeply held beliefs about what is right. From the United States perspective, the story begins with stability. In the decades following World War II, the world was divided by fear and competition. The United States saw itself as a force working to maintain balance, especially in regions where instability could spread quickly. In that context, Iran was not just another country. It was a strategic partner in a critical region. The actions taken over time, alliances, support, intervention were often viewed as necessary steps to prevent greater global conflict. From Washington's view, these were not acts of dominance, but efforts to preserve order in a world constantly on the edge of disruption. But perspective changes everything. From Iran's point of view, the story is remembered differently. For many Iranians, key moments, especially events like the 1953 Iranian coup d'état, are seen as turning points where external influence shaped internal destiny. A democratically elected leader was removed, a system was reshaped. And in the years that followed, outside support was seen by some as interference rather than partnership. This perspective didn't emerge overnight. It was shaped by experience, by memory, and by the way history unfolded over time. Then came later events: the revolution, the hostage crisis, the long period of tension that followed. Each moment reinforced a growing divide in interpretation. One side saw defense, the other saw intrusion. Neither perspective exists in isolation, because both are built on real events, real decisions, real consequences. Even figures like Qasem Soleimani are remembered differently depending on which side of the story is being told. To some, he represented national defense and regional influence. To others, he symbolized broader geopolitical tension. Same person, different meanings. This is where history becomes complex. Not because facts are unclear, but because meaning is not always shared. Both nations, in their own way, believe they were wronged. Both point to moments where they felt threatened, misrepresented, or challenged. And both have built narratives that reinforce those beliefs over time. But beneath those narratives lies a deeper truth. History is not just written by governments or events. It is shaped by perspective, by memory, and by the human need to understand who is right, who is wrong, and where the story truly begins. History doesn't always choose sides. People do. And when you step back and look at the full picture, you begin to see something more difficult but more honest. Not a single story of blame, but two stories running side by side, each shaped by experience, each grounded in reality, and each asking the same question from different directions. What really happened, and who gets to decide? The story doesn't end with an answer. It ends with a question, one that has been echoing through decades of history. Because to understand what happened between Iran and the United States, you have to return to where the fracture first appeared. In 1953, the 1953 Iranian coup d'état quietly reshaped Iran's future. A democratically elected leader was removed. A monarchy was reinforced. To some, it was a strategic move in a dangerous Cold War world. To others, it was the moment trust was broken, when influence crossed into interference. That moment didn't disappear. It lingered beneath politics, beneath alliances waiting. Years later, it resurfaced with force. The Iranian Revolution was not just a reaction to one leader or one policy. It was the release of decades of tension, memory, and identity. For millions, it felt like reclaiming control. A correction of something that had gone wrong long before. Then came the Iran hostage crisis. To the United States, it was a shocking violation. Diplomats held captive, a line crossed in full view of the world. To many in Iran, it was tied to a deeper narrative, one shaped by past actions, unresolved grievances, and a belief that justice had not yet been served. Same events, different meanings, and that is where the story becomes difficult. Because history doesn't always move in straight lines. Actions lead to reactions, Decisions create consequences, and over time, those consequences begin to look, to each side, like deliberate acts rather than connected moments. Was the coup a necessary act of protection, or the beginning of distrust? Was the revolution an act of justice, or the start of new conflict? Was the hostage crisis an unprovoked escalation, or a response shaped by history? The answers depend on where you stand, and maybe that's the point. Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clearer. Each side acted based on its own understanding of security, survival, and control. Each side responded to what it believed was a threat, and in doing so, each side became part of a cycle that fed itself. Not a single betrayal, but a series of decisions, each one justified in its moment, each one questioned in hindsight. Was it betrayal or consequence? Was it power or survival? Or was it both from both sides? History doesn't close this case. It leaves it open because the truth isn't always found in choosing one side over the other. Sometimes, it's found in understanding how both sides arrived at the same conflict from completely different beginnings.